The air was heavy with mist as Cal stepped cautiously into the ruins, his boots crunching against the uneven stones. The eerie silence was broken only by the faint hum of his scanner, searching for traces of the rare minerals he had traveled across light years to study. The alien temple loomed before him, its towering spires covered in glowing ancient symbols that pulsed faintly in the darkness. Cale adjusted his headlamp, its beam cutting through the fog. He wasn't supposed to be here. The sector was off-limits to humans, strictly controlled by the alien race known as the Virillians. But Cale wasn't one to back down from a challenge or an opportunity. The mystery of these ruins had been too enticing to resist. As he moved deeper into the ruins, he heard something, a soft shuffle of movement. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned toward the sound. A shadow moved behind one of the broken pillars, quick and silent. "Who's there?" Cale called out, his voice firm, but laced with curiosity. For a moment, there was no reply. Then, a figure stepped into the dim light. It was a woman. No, not a human woman, but an alien. Her skin was a pale silver, shimmering under the glow of the temple symbols. Her large violet eyes locked onto his, filled with a mix of caution and something else he couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't be here, human," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. Cal's breath caught. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen, both beautiful and otherworldly. But there was something familiar about her, as if he'd seen her before in a dream he couldn't quite remember. "I could say the same to you," Cal replied, trying to mask his surprise. "This area is forbidden, isn't it?" The alien woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear. "I don't have time to explain. You need to leave before they find you." "Who's they?" Cale asked, stepping closer. Her eyes narrowed, and she took a cautious step back. "The Virillian enforcers. If they catch you here, they'll execute you on sight." Cal's mind raced. This wasn't what he had expected. He was just here to study the ruins, not get involved in whatever danger this alien woman was warning him about. But he couldn't just walk away. Not when she looked so frightened, and not when his instincts told him there was more to this encounter than chance. "Wait," he said gently, raising his hands in a show of peace. "If it's dangerous for me, why are you here?" Her expression softened for a moment, but then her jaw tightened. "I don't owe you answers, human. Just go." As she turned to leave, Cale felt a pang of determination. He wasn't going to let her walk away, not without knowing who she was and why she seemed so familiar. "Wait," he called out. "What's your name?" She paused, looking back at him with a mixture of longing and regret. "Viria," she whispered before vanishing into the shadows. Cale stood there, stunned, as questions flooded his mind. Why did her name feel like the key to a story he had forgotten? And why did she seem so desperate to protect him from her own kind? This was no ordinary encounter, and Cale knew he couldn't walk away. Not yet. Cale couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. Viria, her name echoed in his mind as he stood among the ancient ruins. Why did she seem so familiar? And why was she so desperate to keep him away? But Cale wasn't the type to back down, especially when his curiosity was piqued. Adjusting the strap of his scanner, he decided to follow her. He moved cautiously through the ruins, careful not to make noise. The dim light of the glowing symbols painted strange shadows on the walls, adding to the mystery of the place. Ahead, he caught a glimpse of silver skin disappearing around a corner. She was fast, but Cale had spent years exploring dangerous terrain. He quietly quickened his pace, keeping her in sight without drawing attention. As he rounded a crumbling archway, Cale stopped in his tracks. Viria stood at the edge of a platform overlooking a deep ravine. The glow of the ruins reflected off her silvery skin, making her seem almost ethereal. She didn't turn to look at him, but he could tell she knew he was there. "I told you to leave," she said, her voice steady but tired. "Why are you following me?" Cale hesitated, trying to find the right words. Because I think you're in trouble, and I don't walk away when someone needs help. Varia finally turned to face him, her violet eyes scanning him with a mix of disbelief and frustration. You don't understand, human. You shouldn't even be here. If they catch you, they won't just punish you. They'll punish me too. Then why are you here? Kel countered. If it's so dangerous, why risk it? For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, with a sigh, she sat down on a nearby stone, her shoulders slumping. Because this place, it holds something important, something my people have tried to bury and forget. Kale sat down a short distance away, careful not to push her too far. What is it? Varia looked at him, her expression conflicted. A story, a truth. It's hard to explain. My people once lived in harmony with yours, a long time ago. But something changed. Fear, control. I don't know. They erased the past and made it forbidden to even speak to humans. Kale frowned, trying to process her words. And yet, here you are, speaking to me. A sad smile tugged at her lips, because I never stopped believing in what we once shared, even when it became forbidden. Cal's breath caught. Her words stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he couldn't name. We once shared. What do you mean? Varia looked away, her voice barely a whisper. You don't remember, do you? Remember what? Kale asked, his heart pounding. Before she could answer, a sharp mechanical sound echoed through the ruins. Varia's expression turned to panic. They're coming. We have to go. Now. Without waiting for his response, she grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadows, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder behind them. Varia led Kale through a maze of narrow passageways hidden within the ruins. Her grip on his arm was firm, her movements quick and precise. Kale struggled to keep up, the sound of distant footsteps echoing behind them. Whoever was chasing them was getting closer. Where are we going? Kale whispered, his voice barely audible over their hurried steps. To a place they won't look, Varia replied, not slowing down. If we're lucky. They reached a section of the ruins where the walls were covered in glowing, intricate patterns. Varia paused for a moment, her violet eyes scanning the designs. She pressed her hand against a specific symbol, and with a soft hum, a hidden door slid open. Inside, she urged, pushing Kale through the doorway before following him. The door sealed shut behind them, muffling the sound of their pursuers. Kale found himself in a small chamber, dimly lit by the glowing patterns on the walls. The air was warmer here, and there was an ancient, almost sacred feeling to the place. Varia leaned against the wall, catching her breath. This is incredible, Kale murmured, running his hand over the glowing symbols. What is this place? It's a sanctuary, Varia said softly. A secret left behind by my ancestors. They built these ruins as a record of the truth, of the time when humans and Varillians worked together, before everything fell apart. Kale turned to her, curiosity and disbelief written across his face. What happened? Why did your people erase that history? Varia hesitated, her expression conflicted. Fear. Control. The leaders of my world decided it was safer to separate us. They spread lies, made humans into enemies, and destroyed any evidence of our shared past. Speaking to a human, even being near one, became a crime. Kale frowned, trying to process her words. But why? What could they be so afraid of? Varia looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. Because humans have something we don't. Something they feared would change everything. Kale raised an eyebrow. And what's that? She met his gaze, her violet eyes filled with a mix of admiration and sadness. Creativity. Curiosity. The ability to see things not just as they are, but as they could be. It's something my people lost long ago, and it terrified those in power. Kale felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, confusion, and a growing sense of connection to this alien woman who seemed to know more about humanity than he did. And you. Do you believe what they told you about us? Viria shook her head. No, I've seen the truth with my own eyes. I lived among humans once, a long time ago, before they made me forget. Cal's heart skipped a beat. Forget? What do you mean? Before she could answer, the faint sound of footsteps returned, louder this time. Viria's face hardened. They found us. She grabbed his hand and pulled him deeper into the sanctuary. Come on, there's still more you need to see, and they can't stop us from finding it. Kel's heart raced as Viria led him through the dark corridors of the sanctuary. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the low hum of distant footsteps grew louder with each passing second. They didn't have much time. If they didn't move fast, the alien enforcers would find them, and that would be the end of it. Viria didn't speak, but Kel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her grip tightened on his hand. She was scared. Scared for herself, yes, but mostly for him. The fear in her eyes was enough to make Kel want to promise her that everything would be all right. But the truth was, he wasn't sure it would be. They turned a corner, and Kel nearly bumped into Viria when she suddenly stopped. She held up her free hand, motioning for silence. He froze, holding his breath. Through the stone walls, he could hear the voices of the Virillian enforcers, getting closer. They were speaking in their native language, an unfamiliar series of clicks and hisses, but Kel could make out the tone of urgency in their voices. They're coming, Viria whispered, her voice tight with fear. They'll know we're here soon. Kel's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. There had to be a way out, a way to escape. But the ruins were a maze, and he didn't know enough about the layout to find a safe exit. Can we hide? Kel asked, glancing around the darkened corridor. There's no time for hiding, Viria replied, her voice almost a growl. We have to keep moving. They won't stop until they've caught us. Kel clenched his fists, frustration building. He didn't want to run anymore. He wanted to fight, to stand up for the truth he was starting to believe in. He couldn't let her down. But before he could say anything, Viria tugged on his arm, pulling him through a narrow opening in the stone. It led into a small, hidden chamber, a room so deep in the ruins that it almost felt like they had crossed into another world. The walls here were covered in strange symbols and patterns that seemed to shift when Kel looked at them. He could feel the air thick with ancient energy. Viria didn't pause to explain. She moved quickly to the center of the room, where a large stone pedestal stood, its surface covered in dust. Kel followed her, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. What is this place? Kel asked, his voice low. Viria knelt beside the pedestal, brushing off the dust. This is where the truth was hidden. This is where the past lives. She pressed her hand against the stone, and with a soft rumble, the pedestal began to glow. The room was filled with a soft light, casting strange shadows on the walls. Kel stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. What is it? What are you showing me? He asked. Viria looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with determination. This is the history of our people, our real history. The one they try to erase. And it's the key to everything. If we can unlock it, we can change the future. Just as she spoke, a loud crash echoed from the entrance to the room. The enforcers had found them. The enforcers were getting closer. Kel could hear their heavy footsteps echoing through the corridor, and the sound made his pulse race. They didn't have much time. The pedestal was glowing brighter now, casting strange shadows across the stone walls, and Kel felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. Whatever Viria was doing, it was their only chance. She didn't hesitate. With one last glance at Kel, she pressed both hands to the pedestal, and the symbols on the stone began to shift, swirling and changing before their eyes. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and into Kel's chest. He felt a strange, electric sensation, as though the very ruins were alive. What is happening? Kel asked, his voice filled with awe. The records, Viria whispered, her eyes fixed on the pedestal. They're unlocking. Everything we've lost, everything my people tried to bury is coming back. Kale leaned in, his hands resting on the pedestal, feeling the warmth radiating from it. The symbols continued to shift, glowing with an inner light. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and the weight of history, forgotten and hidden for so long, pressed down on him. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The pedestal flickered, and then went dark, leaving the room in silence. For a moment, Kale thought they had failed. But then, the stone began to slide open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. Inside was a small crystalline device, something Kale had never seen before. It shimmered with a soft, ethereal glow, and it felt both ancient and incredibly advanced. This is it," Varia said, her voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. Kale reached out to touch the crystal, but before he could, a voice echoed through the chamber. It was cold, sharp, and unmistakably alien. "Varia, don't touch that." Kale spun around. The enforcers had arrived. A group of tall, armored Varillian soldiers stood at the entrance, their weapons aimed at the pair. Varia took a step back, her body tense, but Kale stood firm, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let them take the crystal. "What is this?" Kale demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "What is it you're hiding?" The leader of the enforcers, a tall figure with dark, emotionless eyes, stepped forward. "You should not have come here, human. You do not understand the danger you've brought upon yourself." Kale's mind raced. He had to act quickly. The glowing crystal might hold the key to everything. It could reveal the truth about the alien human history Varia had mentioned, and it was their only chance to change everything. "Varia, we have to take it," Kale said urgently, his eyes meeting hers. Varia hesitated for a moment, but then, as if making a decision, she grabbed the crystal and held it close to her chest. "We're not leaving without it," she said, her voice full of resolve. The enforcers took another step forward, but before they could react, Varia pressed a hidden button on the pedestal. The stone walls around them began to rumble, and suddenly, the floor beneath their feet shifted, opening into a passageway. "Go," Varia shouted. "Run." Without thinking, Kale grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the newly revealed tunnel. They sprinted through the dark corridor, the sound of the enforcers' voices fading behind them. But Kale knew they weren't safe yet. They were being hunted, and the path ahead was filled with uncertainty. "You said." The tunnel stretched out before them, its narrow walls barely wide enough for Kale and Varia to move side by side. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone, and the only sound was the echo of their hurried footsteps. Varia held the glowing crystal tightly in her hand, her expression unreadable. Kale glanced at her, his mind racing. "Where does this tunnel lead?" Kale asked, trying to catch his breath. Varia didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her violet eyes scanning the dark path ahead. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "It leads to a safe house, a place my people won't find. I've been here before, but I never thought I'd need to return." Kale nodded, though his mind was still on the enforcers. He couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. "Are we safe there?" Varia didn't look at him, but her grip on the crystal tightened. "For now, but not for long." The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper underground. They passed old symbols carved into the stone, symbols Kale couldn't understand. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the air grew colder as they descended further into the depths. Kale's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the Varillian enforcers. Were they still following? Had they figured out the tunnel's entrance? Suddenly, Varia stopped, causing Kale to nearly bump into her. She turned, her face pale in the dim light. "What's wrong?" Kale asked, concern creeping into his voice. "There's someone ahead," she whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. Kale's stomach dropped. "Who?" Varia didn't answer right away. She stepped closer to him, her breath shallow. "I didn't think anyone would be here. Not this far into the ruins." Before Cal could ask what she meant, the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel. A shadow moved ahead, and then a voice, one Cal recognized, broke the silence. "Varia." The voice called, cold and familiar. Cal froze. He knew that voice. It belonged to Zarath, a high-ranking member of the Varillian military. Zarath had once been one of Varia's closest allies, but Cal knew him as someone who would do anything to protect the status quo. The same person who had helped enforce the laws that kept humans and aliens apart. "What is he doing here?" Cal murmured, his hand instinctively reaching for the blaster at his side. Varia's face was a mixture of shock and fear. "I don't know. I thought he was on their side. But now, I'm not sure." The footsteps grew louder, and then Zarath appeared in the tunnel, his tall figure casting a long shadow. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unsettling in his gaze as he looked between Cal and Varia. "Varia," Zarath repeated, his voice colder now. "You're making a grave mistake." Varia stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "Why are you here, Zarath? I thought you were loyal to your people." Zarath's lips curled into a faint, almost sadistic smile. "I am loyal to order, Varia. And order must be restored. You've broken the laws, and now you've endangered us all." Cal's pulse quickened. "You're with them, aren't you? You're working for the enforcers." Zarath's smile widened. "You're too late, human. I've been following you both for days. And now, it's over." Before Cal could react, Zarath pulled out a small device and activated it. The tunnel lit up with a blinding flash of light, and for a moment, Cal felt his body go numb. The world around him spun, and then everything went black. When Cal regained consciousness, he found himself lying on a cold stone floor. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry. Slowly, he pushed himself up, blinking to clear the fog in his mind. The dim light of the tunnel flickered above him, casting long shadows against the walls. His heart raced as he scanned the surroundings. "Varia." He called out weakly, his voice hoarse. There was no answer at first, and panic started to set in. Had Zarath taken her? Had she escaped? Cal quickly got to his feet, his legs unsteady from the shock. He took a few tentative steps forward, eyes searching every shadow. "Varia," he shouted, his voice growing louder, desperate. From the darkness ahead, a soft sound echoed. Footsteps. Cal turned to face the noise, his breath catching in his chest. It wasn't Zarath. It was Varia. She appeared from around a corner, her expression tense and guarded, but when she saw him, her face softened slightly. "You're awake," she said, her voice quiet but relieved. Cal exhaled deeply, still trying to process everything that had just happened. What happened? Where are we? What did Zarath do to us? Varia stepped closer, keeping her voice low as she looked over her shoulder. "Zarath didn't just follow us. He knew what we were doing. He has been working with the enforcers all along." Cal frowned, trying to piece together the puzzle. But why? Why would he betray you? Betray your people? She didn't immediately answer. Instead, she turned and gestured for him to follow her. "We're not safe here. We need to keep moving. I'll explain everything once we're out of the tunnel." As they walked, Cal could feel the weight of her words pressing on him. They weren't just running from the enforcers anymore. There was something deeper, something much darker that Varia wasn't telling him. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, but eventually they arrived at a small chamber. It was unlike any part of the ruins Cal had seen before. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and there was a strange, almost ancient energy in the air. "This is the heart of the sanctuary," Varia explained, her voice quieter now. "The place where the truth has been hidden." She walked toward a stone pedestal in the center of the room and placed the crystal on it. The pedestal hummed to life, and the air seemed to shimmer. Symbols on the walls began to glow, revealing ancient writings Kel couldn't understand, but the energy in the room was undeniable. "This is it," Varia said, her voice filled with awe. "This is the key to everything." Kel stepped forward, looking at the crystal. It glowed softly, casting a pale light across the room. As he reached out to touch it, Varia stopped him. "Before we go any further, I need you to understand something," she said, her eyes serious. "Zaroth was never just a soldier. He's part of a secret faction within my people, a faction that wants to keep the truth buried. They believe that if the humans and Varillians learn the truth, it will shatter everything they've worked to build." Kel's mind raced. The truth. What truth? Varia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the crystal. "The truth about our past. The real reason why we were separated. The real reason the laws were created, and why the humans were made to seem like enemies." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "My people, they feared what humans could do, what you could bring to the galaxy. They feared that if humans and Varillians united, we would be unstoppable. So they created laws to prevent that, erased our shared history, and wiped out the possibility of peace between our worlds." Kel was stunned. He had never imagined something like this. So all the hatred, all the fear, it was based on lies. Varia nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "Yes, and now, the truth is finally ready to be revealed. But if we don't act quickly, it might be lost forever." Kel felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. Everything had changed. The world he thought he knew, the history he had been taught, it was all a lie. But this was their chance to rewrite that history, to create something new. "Then let's do it," Kel said, his voice filled with determination. "Let's show them the truth." The air in the chamber seemed to crackle with anticipation as Kel and Varia stood side by side, staring at the glowing crystal resting on the pedestal. The truth they had uncovered, the truth that could change everything, was now within their reach. But time was running out. The enforcers were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to silence them. Varia's fingers hovered above the crystal, her expression serious. "This device, it holds everything we need to reveal the truth. The records of our past, of how we were once allies with humans. The information is encoded in the crystal. If we can activate it, it will send the message to both human and Varillian worlds." Kel nodded, his mind focused. He understood the importance of what they were about to do. This was more than just revealing the past. This was the key to their future, a future where humans and Varillians could work together, not as enemies, but as partners. But they had to act quickly before Zaroth and the enforcers arrived. "We can't waste any more time," Kel said, stepping closer to Varia. "We need to unlock it. Now." Varia nodded, her hand steady as she placed the crystal into the slot in the pedestal. The moment she did, the chamber filled with a soft, resonating hum. The glowing symbols on the walls began to shift, revealing hidden messages and images that seemed to float in the air around them. Kel's eyes widened as he saw the records of their past. Humans and Varillians working side by side, building technologies and sharing knowledge. "This is it," Kel whispered in awe. "The truth is right here." Varia didn't speak, her eyes focused on the images as they continued to shift. "My people wanted to erase all of this," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "They'd wanted to keep us separated, to keep us in the dark. But the truth is too powerful to stay hidden." Kel watched as the images continued to unfold, showing the peaceful times when humans and Varillians lived together. But then the images shifted to darker scenes, the rise of fear, the political conflicts, the laws that separated their worlds. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. "This is what they feared," Varia murmured. "They feared what we could become if we united. So they twisted the truth, manipulated our histories, and made us believe we were enemies." Kel's chest tightened as he watched the scenes of separation, of division. It made him sick to his stomach to see how they had been lied to. But there was hope. The message was out. The truth was finally coming to light. Suddenly, the door to the chamber slammed open, and Zaroth's cold voice filled the room. "It's too late, Varia," he sneered. "You think you can change everything with this. You're nothing but a traitor." Kel's heart raced as Zaroth stepped into the room, flanked by several enforcers. The air crackled with tension, and for a moment, it felt like everything they had worked for might slip away. But Varia didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes locked on Zaroth. "It's not too late, Zaroth. The truth is out. There's no going back now." Zaroth sneered, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. "You think the truth will save you? You're a fool. The enforcers will stop you. We'll erase this message before it can reach anyone." But as Zaroth moved toward the pedestal, the glowing crystal suddenly flared to life, its light expanding and filling the chamber with a blinding glow. The images of their shared history, the truth, spread like wildfire, visible to every corner of the room. The walls vibrated with the power of the message, and Kale felt the weight of it settle in his chest. This was no longer just about survival. It was about change. "You can't stop it now," Varia said, her voice steady. As the enforcers hesitated, Kale and Varia shared a look, one of determination, one of hope. The truth had been set free, and nothing, not even Zaroth or the enforcers, could undo it. "Let the world see," Kale said quietly. The crystal pulsed with energy, and in that moment, they knew the future had begun to shift. The truth was out, and it would change everything. The blinding light from the crystal slowly faded, leaving Kale and Varia standing in the now silent chamber. The air was thick with tension, but something else too, hope. The truth, the history of their worlds, was now visible to everyone, and there was no turning back. The past had been rewritten. Zaroth's voice shattered the stillness. "You've done it now, Varia. You think this will change anything? You're just a traitor to your own people." His words echoed off the stone walls, but neither Kale nor Varia flinched. They had already won. The truth had been broadcast, a message that could not be erased or hidden anymore. No matter what Zaroth said or did, the damage had been done. The world would know the truth. "You're wrong, Zaroth," Varia said, her voice calm but unwavering. "This isn't betrayal. It's the only way forward. The people of both our worlds deserve to know what was hidden from them." Kale stepped forward, his voice firm. "This isn't about loyalty to your government. This is about loyalty to the truth, to what's right. And your system, your fear and control, has no place in a future where we can work together." Zaroth sneered, his hand gripping his weapon tighter. But there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He had been a soldier, an enforcer of the old laws, but now he faced something he hadn't expected, the undeniable power of truth. "You think the people will believe this?" Zaroth said, his voice laced with doubt. "The truth you've shown them. They'll never accept it. The old order is too strong." Varia shook her head. "They will accept it because they have no choice. They will see what has been kept from them. The truth will unite us, not divide us." The enforcers behind Zaroth shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between their leader and the two humans who had just exposed everything. For the first time, the control they had relied on felt fragile. Their grip on power was slipping. Zaroth's face twisted in frustration. "You're naive, Varia. You think this will fix everything. You think the humans will forgive us for what we've done." Kel's eyes narrowed. "We can't change the past, but we can change the future. And if we don't try, we'll be stuck in the same cycle forever." There was a long pause. Zaroth looked at them, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. It was clear now. He was conflicted, torn between his loyalty to his people and the reality that the world he knew was crumbling. "I'll stop you," he growled, stepping forward again, but his voice lacked the certainty it once had. You won't get away with this. Viria stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. It's already too late, Zarath. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. The enforcers were silent now, their weapons lowered. Zarath could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure anymore. Kale and Viria had done the impossible. They had exposed the truth. Without warning, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a low rumble filled the chamber. The walls vibrated, and for a moment, it felt as if the ruins themselves were waking up, reacting to the power of the truth that had been revealed. Zarath looked around, his eyes wide with fear. This place is going to collapse, one of the enforcers shouted, his voice filled with panic. Viria turned to Kale, her gaze soft, but filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. We need to leave now. Kale nodded, reaching for her hand. They didn't have time for words. They had fought for the truth, and now they had to escape before the old world they had just shattered came crashing down around them. Together, they ran, leaving behind the crumbling remnants of a broken system, and stepping into a future they would build together, one where the truth would guide them, and love would defy all the barriers that had once kept them apart. The tunnel shook as they ran, the walls vibrating under the strain of the collapsing ruins. Kale and Viria didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. The truth had been set free, but now they were trapped beneath the weight of the crumbling world. The shaking intensified, and pieces of stone fell from above, but they kept running, hand in hand, with a shared purpose that pushed them forward. Viria led the way, her eyes scanning the dark passage ahead. We're almost there, she said, her voice steady, though Kale could hear the faint edge of urgency in her words. Just a little further. Kale's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he pushed himself to keep up. They were both exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The enforcers were still close behind, and if they didn't get out now, everything they had fought for would be lost. Suddenly, they burst into a larger cavern. The walls of the cave were covered in strange, glowing symbols, much like those in the sanctuary. But these seemed more ancient, almost alive with energy. Viria stopped, turning to Kale with a look of determination in her eyes. This is it, she said, her voice a little breathless. The way out. Kale looked around, his eyes narrowing as he took in the surroundings. The path was narrow and winding, but it led up toward an opening high above them. The light from the crystal still glowed softly in Viria's hand, illuminating the way. You sure this will get us out? Kale asked, still looking for any signs of danger. Viria nodded. It's the only way. The enforcers won't know about this passage. It's hidden for a reason. Without another word, they began to climb, their footsteps echoing in the cavern as they ascended. Kale's muscles ached, but the thought of freedom, of a new future, kept him moving. They were so close. They had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to take the next step. As they neared the top, Kale could see the faint outline of a tunnel opening. A soft breeze whispered through the crack, and the fresh air smelled like freedom. They were almost there. But then, a voice rang out behind them. You can't escape, Viria. It's over. Kale turned to see Zarath standing at the base of the cavern, his face twisted in anger. The enforcers were just behind him, weapons drawn, their eyes filled with hostility. They had caught up, and it seemed like they were finally ready to put an end to everything. Kale's heart sank, but Viria didn't hesitate. She reached out, gripping his hand tightly. We're not running anymore, she said, her voice steady with resolve. We've already won. The energy in the cavern seemed to respond to her words, the symbols on the walls pulsing brighter. The crystal in her hand flared with light, casting a brilliant glow across the room. Zarath's eyes widened in surprise as he took a step back. What are you doing? Viria smiled, her gaze never leaving him. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Zarath. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the truth, and it's too powerful for you to stop. The enforcers hesitated, unsure of what to do. For the first time, They saw the strength in Varia's eyes, the strength of someone who had fought for what was right, for a future that didn't depend on fear and control. And for the first time, Zarath seemed uncertain. Kel could see it in his eyes. He knew they had already lost. The truth had already been revealed, and there was nothing he or anyone else could do to undo it. With one final determined look, Varia turned to Kel. "Let's go." They reached the tunnel opening, the light from the outside pouring in like a beacon. They stepped into the light, leaving behind the darkness of the old world, and with it, the fear, the lies, and the oppression. The future was waiting for them, and together, Kel and Varia would build it, a future where love, truth, and unity could finally take root. As they stepped out into the world beyond, they knew their journey was just beginning. The dawn of a new era had arrived.